Hi, and welcome to the fourth discussion of One Book, One New Orleans, The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom, which is our 2021 selection for this year. For those of you who might be new, I'll just tell you a quick little deal about what One Book, One New Orleans is. As our name suggests, we pick one book every year, and we encourage everyone in the city to read the same book at the same time, with the idea that we will grow stronger as a community through a shared reading experience. And in this case, stronger as a nation, because I know we've got folks from the West Coast tuning in. But in doing that, we have to remember that we have a 27% functional illiteracy rate among the adults in New Orleans. So we develop a curriculum around the book every year, and we get the book and its curriculum free of charge to adult education programs that teach adults reading at a second grade level and above, programs that are preparing adults for the high set, that's the GED if you're not in Louisiana. In Louisiana, it's called the High School Equivalency Test or high set. Also to adult ESL classes. So if you're new to this country, our book is being used to help you learn English. We also get the book into adult and juvenile prisons for their education program, and also just so the people there have something to read in their libraries. Speaking of libraries, we also provide copies to each branch of the New Orleans Public Library so that if you can read and illiteracy is not your problem, but maybe poverty is, and you can't afford a book, we know that you can go to your library and access that book for free because we provided that book. And then if you have trouble accessing our selected book each year due to visual impairment, we have a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio for the Blind. And they record the book each year and they broadcast it cover to cover. So basically, we pick one book, we make sure that access to that book is not a problem due to traditional barriers for access. And then to bring all of these folks together, we hold a series of 10 to 12 family-friendly community events. Typically, these events are in person and they'll be in a different neighborhood every year so that if you are limited in your means of transportation, one book is going to come to you once a year. We do not repeat the same neighborhood in a calendar year. So right now they're online, and if you can't participate in them in real time, we do have a YouTube channel. Just look for One Book, One New Orleans on YouTube, and you can see all of the things you've missed from April 2020 on. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our discussion leaders, who are both educators and writers, Latoya Taylor and Ambata Kazi-Nance. Thank you, guys. These are volunteers who are giving their time because they love literacy, guys. So give it up for Latoya and Ambata.
Thank you, Megan. So tonight we're going to talk about movement 4. Do you know what it means? Investigations. Okay. So my name is Latoya. I'm originally from Mississippi. I was living in Virginia, and then I moved to the New Orleans area. Actually, this year is going to make my 10-year anniversary. So kind of celebrating that. I actually work for the Charter School Association during the day. And then at night, I'm actually in school. I'm going to be graduating with my master's very soon in education technology leadership. So actually merging my background of IT with education. And then I love reading. So this has been an honor to volunteer for this organization. So thank you all again. Ambata.
Hi, my name is Ambata. I am from New Orleans. I currently live in California in the Bay Area with my husband and my son. I've been here for about 1.5 years, just before the pandemic. And I've been out of New Orleans for about 3 years now. So yes, I'm a writer, I'm an editor, do freelance editing, and also in the past have worked as a teacher for many years, teaching children of various ages and adults, literature, grammar, and writing. So I'm happy to be here. Also an avid reader.
So before we get started, we want to talk about a few group agreements for tonight. We've already identified 3. The first one is to keep the conversation focused on the book. The second one is to have a fun evening. And then the third one is treating one another with respect and valuing all voices. So before we get started, we want to know if there are any other group agreements that people would like to add to the discussion. And you can come off mute or you can just drop them in chat. And then, do you agree with these agreements? I guess I should say that. Okay. So we've been breaking the conversations down into movements. So we just wanted to kind of briefly talk about the 4 movements. We've covered movement 1, the world before me. Movement 2, which I had the honor of co-hosting with Liz, the grieving house. Movement 3, the water. And then tonight's discussion about movement 4, you know what it means, investigations, and then after, like the 11 years after the water. So this is what we'll be talking about today. And then we're just gonna get into the amazing questions.
All right, so our first question, the movement 4 begins with Sarah returning to New Orleans again. This time, this is after Burundi, her time in Burundi, and she's had a kind of a bad breakup, right? So she's coming back to New Orleans. She makes a decision to come back. So we were curious, how do her feelings about returning to her hometown differ from that of her family? Everybody has an opinion about her returning. And so I'll start with that question and then we'll ask the second part. Anybody? Y'all forgot?
I do. I'll throw this out there. I think it's really interesting that, you know, she came back with a job, because I imagine going back to my hometown with a profession would be very different than just going back to like live with my family. And I have no thoughts beyond that. But yeah, the fact that she comes back with a job, a task, something to do is really interesting to me. And I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I was trying to remember if the previous time, if she had gone to New Orleans for the job at City Hall. I couldn't remember. I don't know if anybody remembers. But that seems to be, I guess that says something about her as a person, because she is very, what's the word for it? Like work oriented, right? She goes to Burundi for a specific purpose, and then coming back to New Orleans, first to work at City Hall, and then now again with an even bigger job, right? To write her family story. So I just remember, somebody want to share? So I just remember for Sarah, right? So there's this grief attached to it, right? That she seems to be that she's coming home to mourn, right? Not just her broken relationship, but you know, maybe other things as well. But it's funny because her family was pretty much mostly against it, right? She mentioned about how Daryl, he said he was proud of her for leaving, and he called her crazy for going back. You know, so I thought it was interesting that they were so opposed to her coming back, and that it was a matter of pride to stay gone, to leave New Orleans and then to stay gone. So that leads into the next question. If you're from New Orleans or wherever you're from, if you've left your hometown, whether you wanted to leave or not, how did you feel about leaving, and how did you feel about returning? If anybody can share anything on that.
So I was going to add to your first question, then I'll go into the second part of it. I mean, when I was reading the story, I kind of felt like Sarah wanted to see New Orleans the way other people see it. Like she wanted to be a tourist, and her family is just like, this is home. Like, why are you moving to the French Quarter? This is this is home, but you're looking at it as if this is an experience like some other place that you live, you know, in other parts of the world. And I kind of feel like I take on that role sometimes when because I'm, as I mentioned, I'm originally from Mississippi. So when I go back home, sometimes I'm looking at it from a different point of view. You know, I'm trying to see like, what can I do here? Where do people go? I want to see things that I would never think about going to see if I live there. Because you take advantage of it. It's well, you don't take advantage of it, I guess, in a way. If you have like landmarks or something in your city. For instance, I grew up about an hour from Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm always amazed when people are saying that they're going to see Elvis, you know, and I'm like, oh, people come from all over the world to see, you know, Elvis's home. And I'm like, I've never visited. So it's just one of those things that whenever I go back home now, I'm like, I want to go. I want to go to those places that other people travel from all over the world to see. So I know I have a different viewpoint than like
no, but
my
that's
hometown.
that's a good point though about her where she stays and how that impacts how people view her coming back, right? She's not going back to New Orleans East. She's not going to live in any other area, but the French Quarter, it's pretty eccentric for a New Orleans native, especially a Black New Orleans native, to do that, right? It's privileged and it's also eccentric, you know?
Megan, I couldn't even think of Graceland. I was like, what's the name of his home? Graceland. I couldn't even think of it.
Oh, looking in the chat. Okay.
I have been living away from New Orleans since Katrina, and I had been home for 2 years. I returned after a 16-year departure in 2003, and then was washed away, you know, because of Katrina. And I have been planning and yearning to move back ever since. When I moved back in 2003, it was, in some ways, I felt like a familiar tourist. There were a lot of things that had changed in those 16 years, and I was eager to see and do and eat at all of the new restaurants and do everything. And so being washed away as a displaced because of Katrina, you know, I've always felt that, wait a minute, I didn't get finished. I wasn't finished, you know, relearning my home. And so I think that's part of what has me wanting to get back, which I still intend to do. You know, having rebuilt the family home and all those things, just trying to, I don't have a job to go to there like you did, but yet, you know, so I'm trying to get there. So but a lot of people, it's funny because many of my friends who are there, who either stayed or came back much sooner, were able to get back sooner, say, oh, it's not the same. It's just not the same. And however, whenever I have been home through these years, I've tried to go as frequently as I can. It always feels like home. And just the air is different, you know, it always just feels like home. And that's what I'd like to return to. I know there are a lot of different things that are different, but I think that there also are still, I believe there's still a lot of things that are the same for me.
Yeah, I think so too. I went home for the first time. I'm from New Orleans, and I went to visit in this past June, and this was the first time since the pandemic And it was strange at first. It took me a while. I was there for 2 weeks, and it took me a while to start to feel at home again. I think that probably has to do with the circumstances of the pandemic. And I was also, some things happened within my family that I wasn't prepared for. I had an aunt that died like the day after I got home. And then it was just had a very early post Katrina feeling to it, where it was like, I suddenly felt like I had to check with everyone to make sure they were okay. And instead of just being like, hey, I'm home, let's go out. It's like, is everyone okay? Is everyone alive? And it made me realize, it just felt very different, the circumstances, that heaviness that reminded me of post-Katrina. And then it was also just that feeling of reorienting myself, because it felt like I had been gone for a really long time, because, the pandemic this past year has not been a normal year for obvious reasons, right? So it felt like a longer than just 1 year. Yeah, so it was interesting for me also, because they're not being in New Orleans, not living there anymore, and not wanting to be away for too long, because I don't want to lose touch with it, but at the same time not necessarily wanting to live in New Orleans for many reasons, for personal reasons, and because of just some issues. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to go home, and your reasons for going home, and how people take that, and how it, just that feeling of not feeling as at home, right? Maybe as you did when you were before you left, because it changes you to leave. Yeah.
Hey, I was gonna go back to the original question. I ended up, y'all, I just burned some rice. That's so embarrassing, but I did. I smelled and I was like, oh my God, the rice. Okay. But to go back to the original question about Sarah, when she moved back, I felt like she was trying to get to this place that she had been eliminated from. Like, moving to the French Quarter is kind of like, I don't think a lot of natives, especially Black natives, ever consider what it's like to live in the French Quarter, but definitely have this feeling of, and I speak for myself on this, of that it's like an exclusionary place. So it's very exclusive to live in the French Quarter. And living in the East, it had this feeling of like being isolated from something that she was curious about and wanted to know about. So I took her moving to the French Quarter as this curiosity of like, what is it like to be in New Orleans and like be in this place where most locals don't go. So tying it back to having like this, not just a tourist experience, but like this exclusive experience, or experience that's like one of a kind. Because like, I can't tell you what it's like to live in the French Quarter, but I have thought about like moving to the French Quarter, being a person that's moved away several times. So I moved to Chicago, came back. I moved to Utah, came back. I lived in Texas, came back. North Carolina, came back. But I never had that desire to go to the French Quarter. But I have been curious about like what it's like to be local and live in the French Quarter, because I do have friends that like grew up in the French Quarter, and I have artist friends who have lived there all of their adult life, even though like you wouldn't think that there are people who live in the French Quarter. And I think moving away so young is kind of this mysterious place of like, who are these people and like, how do they live? And that's what I kind of thought she was trying to explore, because it made sense to me in that way.
Yeah, I think also with her being a journalist, like everything you said, India, like it for us being from New Orleans, it's like people don't live in the French Quarter. No one lives there, but of course people do, right? But it just seems so foreign to us. And I think for her as a journalist, it gives her a different way of looking at the city. I mean, it's kind of a distant way of seeing the city. I can't imagine, but yeah, that's a very good point you make.
Yeah, and then she went on to do the research of the place that she was living in. So yeah, the journalism aspect, but I just think it was all about curiosity.
Yeah, I think so
And
too.
trying to like just unbox what has been nicely packaged and hidden from a lot of locals.
Well, I did live in the French Quarter when I first moved to New Orleans. Well, when I flunked out of UNO, but and I went down there to work, and you know, there were a lot of New Orleanians that could afford to live in the French Quarter back in the early 70s, of all races and shapes and colors, and single and families. But then that ended when the tourists buildup of the French Quarter began, and when I moved out, I thought, well, I don't think I'll ever live here again, because it had changed into something completely different. And I was talking to my students yesterday about you know, going downtown, and my student who's from out of town and just got here, he said, well, I'm not going to the French Quarter. They want to go to Bourbon Street, you know, for the crime and, you know, just everything else. And, you know, it's a really, as she so well describes in the book, it's such a beautiful part of our city with such a sordid, complicated, both past, that it's almost, I don't know, it's almost deteriorated even more now. It's still beautiful though.
It is. Thank you for sharing that too. That's a different perspective of the French Quarter, you know, that I'm not familiar with, you know, of people living there. Anybody else want to share anything before we move on to the next question? All right, so looking at, this is from the chapter St. Rose. It's a short chapter, but it's interesting. She talks about where her mother lives in St. Rose, and this issue between the old timers and the newcomers. And one of the things that stood out was about the claim that the newcomers in the neighborhood, they don't have a code, right? And I was wondering if that, you know, certainly that makes me think, of course, gentrification, right? People who move into a neighborhood and or a community, right? An established community. And so this idea of a code, does it ring true for you? And should there be a code, and what should the code for people moving into in a neighborhood or community be?
Can you say the question just one more time?
Yeah, so does it ring true for you, this idea that there's a code, right? That people in a community have a code that they know of, right? And this idea that newcomers or certain newcomers, right, don't have a code. And do you think that there should be? And if you do, what do you think those codes should be? Or you can say for your neighborhood.
I can answer for my neighborhood. I've lived in several areas in New Orleans, including Uptown and Ferret Street, including the French Quarter and the Bayou St. John area. I currently live in the lower Ninth Ward, and I have lived in two places in the lower Ninth Ward, first in Holy Cross to see how I felt about the bridges. And then I bought a house in what has always been known as back of town. Communities change. I've moved around a lot. Sometimes communities change in gentle and meaningful and intentional ways. And sometimes there are things that are like gentrification caused by outside aggressive, greedy development. Sometimes there is an age turnover where everyone was a young family when they bought their starter houses. And then they grew up, the kids moved away and things changed and the neighborhood changes. Yesterday, I was on a meeting with a wonderful 20-something Black man who grew up in the East. And he was very sensitive to say that he's embarrassed to be living uptown because he's afraid to live in the East because of his personal experience in the last year. And I felt such sympathy for him because he was obviously a resident who loved the lower nine and the East, like Sarah Broom did. But Sarah Broom didn't move back to the East yet either. I think it's a complex question that communities sometimes have the glue and the combination to hold, and other times they do not.
Yeah, and your experience sounds similar to mine. When I lived in New Orleans, I grew up in the 7th Ward, but have spent significant time uptown. After I got married, my husband was like, I can only live uptown. That was like, which was totally new for me. I was like, what? You know, and I also lived in the 9th Ward, and I have a lot of family in New Orleans East, so I'm familiar with like moving around in different parts of the city. I think for me, I think definitely neighborhoods do have a code, but I don't know, I feel like in New Orleans, the code might be very similar throughout the city, you know, especially when you're moving in, right? You introduce yourself, you know, get to know your neighbors, you know. I think those are probably like general codes. I don't know if anybody has any experience like in a neighborhood, because for St. Rose, it's very specific about what she says, like everything is tolerated, right? I think that's what they say about the old timers, say everything is tolerated. And then for the newcomers, nothing is tolerated, right? And there's this like lack of respect for the neighbors in a very specific sense, right? If you're having a junkyard and that's not, you know, I think a lot of people feel like that's kind of extreme, you know, to do something like that. And then to be disrespectful about it and just disregarding what everyone else is saying, right? It's not a good way to be a good neighbor.
We have lived in New Orleans part-time for 9 years and then just bought a house last summer in Uptown. And our kids live in Uptown. We had been on the other side of the French Quarter. And so when we bought a house, we were grateful for being able to get to their house without having to go through the quarter to get there. And so they've been kind of helping us figure out the code, because we were in an apartment. And so now we have a house. And I was like, I get up in the morning and I go get my garbage can out of the street, you know, the very first thing in the morning, because that's what the people on my street do. And even if you're not dressed, you know, if you're in your robe or your pajamas, you go get that can out. And my daughter-in-law said, well, that's because they kind of leave the cans around and the parking is precious. And so then you can't get into. So it was very interesting to me to, I could visually see the code. I didn't know the rationale for the code, but I was sure going to comply with it. This was one of my favorite things, what she was talking about. The people, they hung out in the front of the house and the other folks hung out in the back of the house. I remember this because I thought it was interesting that she characterized it as no code rather than a different code. To answer the second question, my experience is you need to learn the way things are done in the neighborhood that you've moved into and do that too.
Yeah, I was military and moved around a lot. And one things I learned early on is there's always a code. Even when they say there's no code, there is a code. But I think a lot of it is it's trust. You know, when someone new moves into a community, especially if it's a tight-knit community, you have to earn their trust, especially instead of just coming in just saying, oh, change this and let's do it this way. You're going to get pushed back like right away until they learn to trust you. And then sometimes you'll realize that the reason why they're doing things a certain way is because that's the better way to do it in that environment. So as one of the people that, you know, would be new to a community, the first thing I do is learn the code, like what's going on here, who are the leaders of the code, I guess the keepers of the code. So yeah, definitely learn the code.
I would like to jump in there. You said a word, trust. I'm Paulina Weber. I'm a student at Dillard University, so I've learned like the campus code, but I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, and I live in an urban area called the South End, and I've lived in the same house my entire life, and it's also the same house my mother has stayed in her entire life. And all of our neighbors are the same neighbors that she grew up with. So they're the same people, and you just, you know, if your mom moves out, then your daughter moves in. Your daughter moves out, and their kid moves in. So it's like, oh, you're such and such's niece, your cousin. And so we trust you because we know your people. And so someone across the street moves in, they're not related, and it's like question marks or who are they and blah, 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 blah. And I think it's just the trust issue and then you know, we try to be welcoming, and then they may not be used to that because we're used to knowing everyone. And I think because I was trying to think like, why do we do that? And I think you said it perfectly, trust. So
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, Ellen, I really like the example you gave of the garbage cans, because I was like, oh yeah, that is definitely a thing, at least in New Orleans. And it's one thing to be new and to not know that, but once you realize like, oh, this is what everybody does, if you're still that person who doesn't do it, then that's when people are gonna be like, wait a minute, you know by now, right? Yeah, so that's really that's a good example. And yes, the trust, right, is which is something that is earned over time, you know. And it's just, to me, it seems like it's not hard if you come into an environment with a willingness to learn how things are done and to acknowledge that you're new, right, and that no one knows you, and so it's up to you to make those first steps, right, not for your neighbors, right. Yeah. Anyone else before we move on? All right, so let's see, we're looking at the chapter St. Peter. So it's kind of a big question. So Sarah says, my reaching to understand the French Quarter was a yearning for centrality, a leading role in the story of New Orleans, which is to say, the story of America. And this is a big quote, so it stood out to me, you know, to think like, how can the story of New Orleans be the story of America, right? And then her emphasis on a singular story of New Orleans, right? Because it's the story, it's always the story. What might she be saying? What is the story, the official, right, story of New Orleans?
This is a tough question, but in a lot of ways, the story of New Orleans is a story of America. To say that it's a story of commerce and trade in all things necessary and lethal. And you know, it was because we were the port of the complete South for a time, and we were dealing in such trade as you know, cotton and produce, and we were the you know, the door to South America, but we also the door to the slave trade and importing enslaved people and music and you know, we just so to say that we're the story of America, I think we're the story of America and the growth of America in it's which, you know, I'm going to segue a little bit here, which when Hastert said after Katrina, why does New Orleans matter anyway? He was absolutely devoid of any historical importance of the city. We're also the mouth of the Mississippi, which can be looked at as sort of flushing out the worst of this country, but also embracing and opening ourselves and distributing perhaps and often at times the best, from culture to goods to enslaved peoples that gave us all of those things that I've pretty much mentioned. So in that way, I think we are the story of America.
Yeah, I think the key word, Nancy, in your statement was about commerce, right? And I think in the sense of like what Sarah talks about in this section, like what New Orleans is selling, right? There's the obvious, the actual goods, and then there's the selling of culture, right? Music and food and whatnot, and who benefits from that and who doesn't. And I think that's what she's talking about. I was thinking about, because she also used the word mythology, right? So this idea of story versus mythology, right? There's the mythology of New Orleans, right? The French Quarter, right? Because she talks about how this little part of New Orleans becomes all of New Orleans to most people, right? Who never visit outside of, you know, the French Quarter. Maybe they go to the Garden District, right? But to visit New Orleans and to only go to this one small part, right? Where the culture is carefully packaged, right? And contained. Yeah, so I just thought it was interesting. I forget how she says it, but the real story, right? For the people who, not the visitors, but the people who live in the city, who can't afford to live, you know, in the French Quarter, who are literally bussed into the city, right? She says it's a story of dysfunction. What was the word? Dysfunction and hopelessness, right? So this idea of these inequalities and these inequities that allow New Orleans to sell culture, right?
Absolutely. And what really strikes me about that quote is yearning for centrality, a leading role, right? Because you can't be centered unless someone else is marginalized. And you can't have a leading role unless there are supporting characters. So there's this really interesting way in which she's drawing attention to sort of what's pieces of the story we privilege and who gets privileged and why, which I think is also that's kind of the story of America too. I think if we think about what we learned in history class, we only learn pieces. We learn privileged narratives, not the whole picture. Just like you're saying, you know, who gets to benefit from the commerce in New Orleans, who gets to benefit from being the center of the story.
It reminds me of her brother talking about the street cleaners coming through the French Quarter. And, you know, he said, you know, we can't get any of our streets fixed anywhere else, but y'all got machines coming through here every day and cleaning these streets. And it's, you know, the difference between what's sold, the myth that's sold, and what the truth is, and how much goes into maintaining the myth. so it can be sold.
Yeah, Nancy said in the chat, it's a beautiful place built by people of color, yet not populated by them, and now mostly by tourists, right? Just to go back to what we've kind of been talking about, how, you know, for me growing up in New Orleans, I didn't think of the French Quarter as a place that I was welcome to go. Like, it was like, why would I go there? You know, there was also, yes, the tourists. Like, if I have friends or family who come to town, they want to go to the French Quarter, it's like, okay, only for you. You know, it's like, but because to me, the real city is outside of the French Quarter in a lot of ways. But thank you, Nancy, for reminding too, like the beauty and the architecture and all these things that even for myself as a local, I forget about because of my complicated feelings, you know. I only went to the French Quarter as a child on field trips. So which is interesting, right? To go to the French Quarter for a field trip, and because it really felt like going to a different city. And I also, like Sarah, I worked in the French Quarter. I worked in the service industry for a few years, you know, and that was my real introduction to, you know, so I was one of those people catching the bus from the 7th Ward into the French Quarter, and that was, I went to work and then go straight home. Yeah, so that's really interesting that that's what people think of when they think of New Orleans, but that's not what most people from New Orleans think of when they think of, you know, I guess the real story or real stories of New Orleans. All right, so let's look at the chapter McCoy. So McCoy Street, that's the street that Carl lives on. So the question is, how does Carl embody New Orleans East to Sarah? And what do you think it means that Sarah situates herself in the French Quarter, which is the antithesis of New Orleans East? Well, what can we say about Carl, first of all, and how, what can we say about New Orleans East and about Carl? What do they have in common?
I think that he embodies New Orleans East in the sense that it's stagnant or considered stagnant and not progressing or growing. She makes her way over there often, probably like almost I think it was every day she was going there. Mm-hmm. I should have my book on my nose, but I didn't make a note about how often she went, but like she was going every day. As in some ways I was like, is she trying to see if he's gonna make progress, or if this house is gonna some way make progress, while her mom was trying to work her way through this road home. As I read this book, it just brought back so much trauma.
Right, yeah.
Around, even, you know, I could relate so much to people being displaced, in specifically my mom and my sister, and like watching them go through this process and like nothing changing. And I think that Carl embodies that whole idea of hopelessness, but yet being hopeful at the same time. And the second part of the question was, what do you think it means that Sarah situates herself in the French Quarter? I think that it also reminds her that there is another side to the story, and that there are two parts to every story, and being on the other side reminds her of that constantly, like going back to see is just a constant circle and reminder of why she's there, because she did go back to write this book this trip home, or I don't even know, I don't want to call it trip home, but a relocation home was her rationale, was why she came here to write the book and was able to write the book. So making that circle every day to the east and back to the French Quarter was like this constant reminder of the reason why she was there, and offered maybe comfort and like inspiration to continue to write the book. Because sometimes when you're not in a place, you lose sight of what you're doing. Like I don't know, I'm not her, but I don't know if she could have written this book somewhere else. I feel like to write this book and have all the data, historical facts and information that she has in it, like she had to be in this place, and she couldn't write it just in the French Quarter. She had to go to the east every day or often to get the inspiration and motivation that she needed, and also to be in a place and actually write from and to incorporate it in a way that is truthful and authentic. And I think that's what Carl also embodies for her, not just the state that is stagnant and not growing and a lack of progress, but also the authenticity of this story that she's telling.
Yeah, I found it interesting that I think other than when she first moves in, I don't think Carl ever goes to the French Quarter. Like I mean, maybe he does. I have to go back through the book, but I remember she describing how he was uneasy, like and became increasingly uneasy being there. Right. I think there was a line, something about not everybody's supposed to be in these quarters. Right. So he kind of see, in terms of like maybe feeling not welcome, like he seems to be very aware of that. Right. And it makes him uncomfortable,
Yeah, I don't think she actually says that he doesn't go, he never comes back after that first time.
I think her placing herself in the French Quarter too, India, I think you made a good point about where she needed to situate herself in order to write this story. I'm wondering too, if she could have written it if she was living in the East, if she was living there, that might have been too close a proximity for her to get a perspective to write about it. If she was in it, being there's a phrase used, being in it but not of it, but it's almost like she was of it but not in it in order to write about it. So maybe she felt she needed that bit of distance. She needed to be in proximity, but maybe with a little bit of distance to be able to record it, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you both of you are right in that sense that she needed that distance, But I guess I also thought with her being just in India mentioned about like she goes to Carl every day, right? Yes, there's the official reason, which is that she's writing a book, and he is this represents the home, and he literally like guards the plot of land that they lived on. But I guess I was also thinking with her being the youngest, the little sister, this idea of like him being kind of a protective force for her. Because I was trying to imagine like what it might be living in the French Quarter by herself. Yes, she's lived, in other countries and everything like that. But it was needing that connection to home. And, sometimes you want to be on your own. And then when you're on your own, you're like, I want my family, I want my friends, I want my big brother, because, India, you mentioned like the stagnation, right? But I guess that's also kind of a constant force too, in a weird way, like someone that you know where he's going to be, where he goes, he has a set routine that he follows. If he's not at his, what does he call the house on McCoy? He calls it his, I forget what he called it, but it was because it's it's a one room place, right? So
His little room, yes.
So it's like if he's not there, he's at his job at NASA, or he's gonna be, you're gonna find him on Wilson Street eventually, right? Because I think there was the chapter where they wait forever for him to show up. They know eventually he's gonna be there, right? Because he doesn't go but a few places, right? And I thought it was interesting, just one more thing, that I think this was the chapter that opened with talking about dumped bodies, like that being an area where people dump bodies. And it's like the fact that Carl, like, not just that he lives there, but he feels comfortable there, says a lot about his personality, you know? Because she calls the East wilderness in comparison to French Quarter. She says it's an encroaching wilderness, right? And the fact that that's where he likes to be, right? In the wilderness, hidden, right, from people. And he's very, he doesn't give a lot of information. Like when they ask him about the dead body, he's defensive about it, as if like, you know, it was like he had an odd reaction to having to answer questions about it. So he's definitely just an interesting figure in general. You know, even though it's not a novel, he was like my favorite character. And I think Sarah's too, because she talks about him so much in the book. She begins the book with him and ends the book with him.
Reading the book gave me a broader perspective of what is considered New Orleans East. I wasn't really familiar with this part of the East when I lived there, grew up there. I mean, the East was where all these new houses were and these new apartment complexes, and where the Plaza Mall was with the ice skating rink. And, you know, it was new and shiny. And so if you lived in the East, but here, reading this book, I learned about the part of the East that existed before that, the shiny part, the new development, and Bullard Avenue. And I had an aunt who moved out to Bullard Avenue, and, you know, those types of things. And so it was like a discovery for me. It's like, what? Okay, well, and so that was one of the things that I liked about reading this book, was to learn even more about my hometown and to, you know, learn more of the nooks and crannies and the folds and wrinkles that exist there.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, because I'm familiar with both of those aspects of New Orleans East, because where Sarah's, where the family home on Wilson Street, my mother and grandmother actually lived like maybe just a few blocks from there. So there's that New Orleans East. So it's funny because within this wilderness, you have, right, you have the shiny part of the East, as you mentioned, which a lot of people don't know about. And then you have the part, you know, because New Orleans East is huge. It's a very big space. So yeah, you have the place where they dump bodies and you know, everything's overgrown, and that's, so it's a wilderness within a wilderness, right?
I wanted to follow behind that. I'm still learning my way around the city, but I've spent a few times on Bullard Avenue at a church, United Methodist Church. I can't even think of the name of it. But when I associate New Orleans East, that's all I think of. And I'm reading the book and it's like Chef, and I know the street name, and I'm like, you know, Cornerstone, yes ma'am, that's the one. And so I've been there several times, but I attend church in Central City. I'm trying to learn, but when I go to the East, but then they were like, Chef, and I'm like, wow, I've been in New Orleans East more times than I realized, but I didn't, you know, people just don't call it that. And so reading this book has helped me to just associate what's what and where things are. And I've been here about 3 years now, so that was interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say, I don't think anybody goes on Chef Ventura Highway if they don't have to. Oh, unfortunately, that's the case.
Well, I think that it's really complex how the Ninth Ward goes from, how many of you ever been to the Isles, to Venetian Isles? The gated white communities on islands?
Oh, I've
The
heard of
south,
it.
yeah, that's in the east. And then it goes through all sorts of industrial areas. I walked the census and I walked in the East because I speak Spanish. And there are camps of Spanish speaking human beings and families that live in places in the East that are overgrown, or they're behind where things are overgrown. And it's part of what happens when a place is so big and not tracked. And I thought about the challenges of her family trying to figure out, well, do we really want to do that whole fight? Is it worth winning the battle? It is a very, very complex area. I'm watching with interest the redevelopment of the Six Flags and the fact that the people who would benefit from it are very hard to get them involved, because they're the people that she's talking about in the book. They're the people that are not used to using a voice to bring their community forward. And it's interesting to see these development meetings, because they're like the people in the book. And if that development were anywhere else in the universe, it'd be something by now, and it'd be making money and people would be working. But because of the kind of personality that is disempowered generation after generation, and some of that probably genetic influence of what we do to protect ourselves, we see a very different response. And I think she caught that very well in the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Any other comments? I know we're short on time, and I have a few more. We have a few more questions. Okay, so going back to the story of the city, right? So in addition to this idea of there being an official story, right? Sarah interrogates the idea of who has the right to the story of the city. And this was a really interesting meditation that she has on this. And she says authenticity and loyalty to New Orleans are crucial. And to criticize New Orleans is to put one's authenticity at stake. So how do you all feel about that statement? Do you agree with that? And for those familiar with New Orleans, do you think this issue of authenticity was always an issue for New Orleans, or a post-Katrina innovation? And then lastly, is it unique to New Orleans?
I think authenticity came into play post Katrina, because prior to, I wish I could think of the source for this, but after Hurricane Katrina, a survey showed that a specific percentage of New Orleanians had never traveled outside of the state of Louisiana prior to the hurricane and having to evacuate New Orleans. And it was a large percentage. It was definitely over 70. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I know the statistic came from some Red Cross data that they were collecting. And so to be in the sense of authenticity that I'm interpreting this as, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's also connected to how native to New Orleans you are, or how long you have existed in the space. Because that's really heavy, especially in these last 15 years. How long has it been? 15, 16, however many years it's been. It's coming up on an anniversary, I know, but I know that question is constantly asked now, and the question like, where are you from, or how long have you lived here, carries so much weight now. Whereas before Hurricane Katrina, I don't really, and I, being an adult then and being an adult now, and like just being in conversation, that wasn't something that carried as much weight as now. I don't think that there were as many people here that were not natives as now. Like the population has changed so much that it is like if you question or if you criticize anything about New Orleans, um, especially the nativeness of New Orleans, then like it's very risky because it's it can cause a lot of tension, it can cause arguments, and that's a lot to do with people just not going back to the whole idea of there being a code. There's a code around speaking statements or making statements about New Orleans, whether they're true or there's data to support it or some type of stat to support it. It's certain things that if you say within a certain population, whether it's a local population or a local to a group of people who have relocated to New Orleans or have or what people call transplants, that carries tension as well. So people people can't criticize New Orleans in a way, especially to those who consider it home, and people who consider New Orleans home or are natives of New Orleans in some ways find their approach or met with conflict if they criticize people who are not natives or who are transplants. So like that tension is real. And I do think it comes from people, it usually arises from people making general statements or making assumptions or speaking in ways that they don't have firsthand knowledge of. It leads to a lot of controversy and issues. And I think that's all post Katrina. Or mostly post Katrina.
Yeah, you just said a mouthful. There's so many different directions you can go in what you talked about, and I think that points again to this idea of one story, right? Because to think about authenticity, there's as you mentioned, the local versus transplant. That's a whole other question of authenticity, right? The New Orleans journalist, I'm thinking about the New Orleans journalist Megan Braden Perry, who has spoken pretty loudly about this idea of people who are not from New Orleans who and this is definitely a post-Katrina innovation of what makes you a New Orleanian, and it's all like not artificial things, but eating red beans on Monday. And like, if you don't eat red beans on Monday, then you're not a New Orleanian. If you don't go to second lines, then you're not a real New Orleanian. And I love her writing because she just points out all the flaws in that. Like those are outside things. They don't make you a New Orleanian, and that's definitely has been a local versus transplant conversation, right? I don't want to monopolize the conversation though. If anybody wants to share the thoughts.
If it's okay, I'm actually zooming in from Boston. I
Nice,
stumbled
nice.
into this.
Welcome.
Thank you. And I've been to New Orleans twice in my life, most recently this year. And I've read most of the book, but what New Orleans has so many different parts of it, just like any major city. It has that there is perhaps no one New Orleans except that the stories everybody subscribes to. There are these central stories, Katrina being, if you went through Katrina, you are a real New Orleans, if you, and some people's minds, it's the French Quarter that's the real New Orleans, but it's full of change, it's full of history, it's full of goodness and badness and corruption and generosity. And I understand how she comes back to want to capture it because she has left it. And when you leave it, you leave, you're trying to encompass what you've left in those different times and trying to grab hold of it. And it's hard, and it's hard. It's just, it's I mean, as an outsider, I see New Orleans as so complex. And maybe it's because I've read the book, or at least most of the book. And when I was there, I wasn't particularly interested in the French Quarter, and felt like if I was going to really understand the city, I needed to see a lot more than the French Quarter. So I don't know. That's just an outsider's perspective. And I think part of what makes a place so familiar and home, frankly, is the air, the light, the plants, um, and of course the food and those assumptions that you take for granted if you have grown up in a tight neighborhood. You know, if you have grown up in a place where everybody drags in their garbage cans, um, and it can be microcosmic in the mid in the 5 blocks over. That sense of home can be entirely different. It's and if you move 10 blocks in the city, perhaps you're living in a different city for some people. Um, so it's a very complex place. And then if you move away, all of a sudden your perspective changes. So those are just some thoughts. Thank you.
I will say, from listening to Janina, that's right. Okay, just listening to what you said, having lived in Chicago and lived in Houston and lived in Winston-Salem and also lived in Cedar City, Utah, that New Orleans is very different, and people who have lived here can see it. Where there are many stories, but there's definitely more shared experiences amongst Black New Orleanians than any other city I've been to. And just speaking of a Black demographic in the different cities that I've lived in, like the amount of shared experiences that we share it's huge compared to other places. Like in Chicago, you have the West Side, the South Side, the North Side, and I lived on the West Side and the South Side. And living in those two places, definitely completely different experiences. But like, Ambata growing up in the 7th Ward, and then me growing up, born in the 7th Ward, but growing up in Mid City, like we still share so many common experiences that in Chicago, living on 79th and then going 10 blocks down to the 80s, they don't even share those same experiences. And here we are, blocks and blocks apart, yet we still go to the candy lady house and we still go and get frozen cups. We still jump double dutch. We know the same songs and the same dances. We have the same friends. You meet one person and it's like literally 1 degree, maybe negative 1 degree of separation here, where you meet somebody, you go somewhere. Anytime I go somewhere, I know somebody. Like if I go to a wedding, I'm going to know somebody there. Like in this, it's not that, it's just that that's how close knit it's all. The storyline is very much can be looked at as singular, but also expansive. So like from that single storyline, it comes expansion. But I feel like we can all draw ourselves back down to like something in common, no matter where you were, multiple things in common. Whereas in other places, it's not that you don't share as many experiences with people from different neighborhoods. Yeah. So it's like complicated, but also very simple.
One thing that strikes me when you say that is that people in Chicago, if you're looking at the Black demographic, they were immigrants. You're looking at, for the most part, immigrant communities who came not just from Mississippi, they may have come from Alabama or Georgia and gone straight up. And I've actually often thought of this, if you look at the West Side or the South Side of Chicago, and you begin to, you begin to trace backward, would you find states and cities from which people originally came? Whereas in New Orleans, the history, that's like the old country in a way, is what it strikes me as. With, at least for people who are, I don't, for the most part, it just strikes me as the old country, especially for Black New Orleanians, if I'm saying that right. And that's, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a guess.
Yeah, I just want to say those are really good points that you guys are making. Like India, I've also lived in a few other places. And I never really thought about that. But that really is true because I lived in Connecticut. Janina, what you were saying about like immigrants, right? African immigrants and Caribbean, from the Caribbean. And in Connecticut, I had such a hard time, you know, connecting with people. And so I thought, oh, well, other Black people, right? But they were the most, I don't want to say standoffish, but it was just like, I felt such a disconnect, you know, which was really surprising. And I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was just because I was from the South and I'm just normally just used to you can stop anybody in New Orleans and talk on the street with somebody. Whereas in Connecticut, they would look at you like, who in the world are you? Like it was very highly suspicious, you know? And so I think, yeah, that's a really good point that both of you guys are making about, you know, how New Orleans might be different, you know, from other places in terms of Black communities and that close connection. And I have felt that here in the Bay Area in Oakland, which I have learned that a lot of Black Oaklanders do have roots in Louisiana. So I find it interesting that because when I'm in Oakland, I'm like, it feels like New Orleans a lot of ways, the way people walk, the way people talk, it's like, this is so weird. I've never been any other place other than New Orleans where it felt that much like New Orleans. And so for them to have Louisiana roots is like, oh, well, like, that's amazing how that can continue on, you know? Do we have time for any more questions, Megan? I think we're at our time.
I'm good with going if y'all are.
Let's see. What are we other questions? Well, I guess maybe we just move to the last question.
Yeah, I was just gonna say if we do hit another one, I was gonna suggest the last one.
Yeah, because the other ones are kind of loaded too. So let's just moving to the end of the book. That last the what was it called? The is that an epilogue? I'm not sure. Sorry. But what's that?
After the epilogue.
Oh, after, right. So there's she wraps up with what happened, the results of Road Home, right? That's that and the aunt's death. And so she says that there are always, I have come to know, more questions than answers, which is such a wonderful journalist writer way to end the book, right? Because we do have a whole lot. I was like, wait, no, you can't end. So what feelings were you left with by the conclusion of the book, and what lingering questions do you have?
Strangely for me, it was what is home? You know, I move around a lot, and I tend to tell people, I'm like, I'm not feeling this area anymore. And then I pick up and move. And after reading this book, I realized, like, I think I'm trying to find home. And for me, I don't even know if that is actually moving back to Mississippi or somewhere else, but I'm like, what is home to me? Where is home? Is it internal? Is it external? Do I need to keep searching? Will it always be a part of me? So that was my lingering question that I'm still asking myself, like, what is home? Because to be honest, in 2019, I actually moved back to Mississippi, but I still didn't feel settled. I'm like, okay, I'm living in the place that I grew up, but it still didn't feel like home. So then I moved back here, and now I'm like, okay, I kind of feel like this feels more like home than actually where I grew up. But that was just seeing someone else kind of go through some of those same questions, and then I didn't even realize I had those same questions. Kind of hit me a little bit.
That's deep. I wasn't even thinking about that, but now I am. Because I've been moving around the past few years and I'm just like, I don't know. I have no
Right. I'm
idea.
like, I don't
I don't necessarily
know.
want to go back to New Orleans, but New Orleans is always home and familiar, but I don't know if I want to live there, you know.
I also I went to like 9 different schools and was an Army brat and lived all over. And when I got to New Orleans, I felt like I was home. And I never thought I'd stay. And now I can't imagine living anywhere else. Katrina just locked it in, you know, because after Katrina, you had to get back. You had to get back. And that whole where you from, back then when someone said, you from New Orleans? Oh yeah, I'm from New Orleans. It didn't matter how old they were, didn't matter what color they were, it didn't matter. It was just, we wanted some piece of home. And so, you know, I was thinking about that at the end of the book. And I just want to say that Paulina is a student of mine at Dillard, and we're doing this, we're working with One Book, One New Orleans on this book and the surprise next book, next year's book. And my students were reading this one and we just started discussing it. And I was so glad she was so interested in it, just because we've only been to class 2 days. I also, we just started talking about Carl today. And I have to say that that's one of the things, not only did I miss about this book, but I wonder, where's Carl, man? And I'm on my way to Bay St. Louis tomorrow, and we're gonna go down Wilson Street and see. So, but I really appreciate this discussion, and I wanna thank you, and it's gonna help my discussion next week, for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope Carl is not there when you pass Wilson Street. Because that was my question. I was just like, what about Carl? What's he gonna do? I just felt so heartbroken, you know, because I mean, yeah, that was one of my earlier questions that we didn't get to ask. Like, but when she calls him the Sentinel, right? He stands guard on Wilson Street, and it's like, what is? Which I've seen on her Instagram. I've seen pictures of him. He's perfectly fine and healthy now. But you know, it's just this idea of just, it's like, I just imagine him still being there, you know?
And the thing that really struck me, and that's my favorite image in the whole book, is him letting her cut the grass, and that she ended with that. I just loved that. But it also, this entire book has been about the yellow house. It's the title of the book. And yet the house was gone and it was still home for him. And so it was just, it was like home doesn't even depend on having the house there. And that just, I thought that was an incredible way to end the book. I did. Really.
I thought Ellen was still talking. So I thought at the end of the book, she's with Carl, and I feel like there is no main character, right? Like the house is the main character. I was talking about this with someone else, and I was like, is the house the main character? Or anyway, I guess I need to stop trying to analyze it in that sense. But I felt like
good question,
Carl, parts of me felt like Carl is central. If there is a main character, definitely in the last 2 movements, Carl becomes in the last movement, the one we're talking about 4, Carl becomes like the main character. And part of me in my question is, and I think we talked about this before too, Ambata, like whose story is it to tell? And it's like, for me, I'm wondering I'm questioning more and more whose story things are to tell, especially with this whole idea about the authenticity of New Orleans and like who gets to tell these stories about New Orleans. And it's like, okay, so Carl has this very unique story that is being shared by his sister, and other people have these unique stories, but would Carl ever tell his own story? And if the answer is no, then who has the right, or who can tell that story in the most authentic way to him? And do people get permission for you to tell their stories, or can you just share stories that you feel need to be shared that will otherwise not be shared. And so that's like my biggest question about it. And if the Yellow House is the main character of the story, the Yellow House can never tell its own story. So should it be told, or who should it be told by? Could someone else have told the story? Or and I think about that personally, because I know telling my family story, and she talks about this too. Sarah talks about this in the book, like sharing family stories is not okay with most people, especially a particular, it's generational.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about the different generations, like sharing things is not it's not tolerated, it's not accepted in this because people don't want you in their business. Like, you know, your mama always say, well, my mama and my grandmother say, don't go out there and tell my business. I don't want you telling my business. And in the Yellow House, like, she telling their business. And so that's my biggest question. It's like, okay, so who gets to tell the stories?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good question too, because I was curious about that a lot too, like how that, like what was it like after the book was published for her family
Mm-hmm.
members, you know, and then for Carl and for all of them, you know. I remember Jessamine Ward, after she wrote her memoir, she said, I think it was her mom that was basically like, I still love you, I don't want to talk to you for a little while. I think, you know, so like that, and that's real life, you know, that's real talk. And Jessamine Ward's book was much more personal than the Yellow House. But yeah, it's like, I wonder what it was like for her and her family after this book came out. Like, did they read it? What did they think about it? What did they think about what she said? I mean, that's a lot of questions there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It
Oh
was
yeah,
also
the men
really,
we raped. Yes.
yeah. In that scene Ellen mentioned too, it was really interesting because on one hand, she seemed to really want to be a part of helping to take care of the Yellow House, right? She says, I'll cut the grass. So, you know, still being sort of a part of its story and one of its caretakers. But it was also really interesting because what I saw was also how far removed she was, because she made a point of saying, I wore shorts and flip-flops to cut the grass. And I'm going, on a riding lawnmower, you wore shorts and flip-flops? Right? And so that to me was both like, I'm in this, but I'm also so disconnected from this, you know?
You know, Megan, can I build on that a little bit? This morning, I have an empty lot next to me. The lower ninth ward is 80% empty. So having an empty lot is nothing. Some of them are overgrown, some of them are mowed. The empty lot next to me is under odd ownership. It's often overgrown. This morning, a different family member who introduced herself as a family member was there at 7 o'clock in the morning with scrubs, like on her way home from working in a medical setting, mowing the lawn with a push lawnmower, because her family is not going to lose that place. And I was thinking about, and it actually brought to mind the Yellow House, because I'm thinking about, wow, how tired must you be that early in the morning on your way home, but your family's not going to lose that lot. It made that Yellow House very real to me this morning. She also mentioned it was going to be like 100 degrees at 9 o'clock, so, which it was.
Does anybody else have anything else to share? Or? I like the idea of thinking of who the main character is, and if it's the Yellow House and whatnot, because it's also interesting. Just one last thing, I think that I was curious because Sarah refers to the Yellow House, but it wasn't yellow, I think, until either just before she was born or something like. So I'm like, what do the rest of the family call the house? Do they think of it as the Yellow House? And that's her memory, you know. Okay. thank you all for coming to this conversation. Appreciate everybody's input. And yes, Latoya, the only reason why I can write about my parents is because my mom has passed on, and my father is, I write about him as well, but he's alive, but he has degenerative disease. And so he's basically he can't tell me if he doesn't like it or not. I could never write if it was, if it was any other case. Yes.
For me, I'm fascinated to read it because I'm like, what are you gonna put in there that I don't already know? Like, yeah, that's why I'm kind of like, wait, who is this woman? I want to know now.
Yeah, it's a bold thing to write about your family. Definitely,
it is.
Yeah. I think Sarah does a good job though in this book, as she really tries to elevate everyone.
Latoya and Ambata, thank you so much for your work facilitating this discussion, guiding us, leading us through some really difficult and beautiful questions. What a way to end these 4 discussions. I'm so humbled by what you created for us tonight. Thank you. Just a couple quick things coming up. Actually, right now, through the 22nd, which is this coming Sunday, you can bring school supplies for teens facing unstable housing and incarceration to 5757 Magazine Street. We're collecting those and we'll take them where they need to go. 5757 Magazine is the Kendra Scott store, the jewelry store here in New Orleans. And they're partnering with us on this all weekend long for our East Coast and West Coast folks and our Hammond folk, I think it is, Karen. You can shop at kendrascott.com all weekend long and enter a code, which I will post on our social media and also email out to everyone. And that code will then trigger 20% coming back to One Book, One New Orleans. If you're local, you can come shop from 1 to 3 at 5757 Magazine Street on the 22nd. And we're getting 20% of sales for those 2 hours. So if you want to bring school supplies for at-risk youth or purchase things to support the cause, we've got you covered through the 22nd. Thank you. Oh, and also 1 month from today, we're kicking off National Family Literacy and Adult Education Week, which will then be followed immediately by Banned Books Week. So we've got things coming up for both those weeks. Stay tuned. And we will see you hopefully this weekend, if not before. Thank you once again for being here for an amazing discussion.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Ladies. Excellent, excellent.